What if your sentence wasn't jail but a forced marriage to a woman the town valued at just $5? Would you harden your heart or risk everything to defend her dignity, confront your own sins, and turn a cold courtroom's humiliation into the first real home you've ever known at last? The cold in that courtroom was a bitter, searching thing. It wasn't just the January wind rattling the window panes or the snow melt seeping through the floorboards to stain the pine. It was a cold that got into a man's bones, a cold that came from the stares of his neighbors. I stood before Judge Wallace, my hat clutched in my raw-knuckled hands, and felt that chill settle deep in my soul. My name is Jacob Thorne, and I was about to be sentenced. At 34, I was no stranger to hardship. My life had been etched onto my face by the wind and sun of the high country, carved into my hands by rope and leather and the unforgiving steel of a gun. I'd spent years breaking wild horses and driving cattle, a life that left a man lean and wary. But the trouble that brought me here wasn't from the wild, but from the bottom of a whiskey bottle. A foolish argument in town, a stray shot from my old Winchester, meant to scare, not to kill. But the steer belonging to Leland Cobb, the town's most influential merchant, had dropped dead in the frozen mud of the alley. Now packed into the Blackwood Ridge courthouse, the whole town seemed to have turned out for the spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood smoke and the faint sour scent of judgment. I didn't have the money for a fine. Leland Cobb had made sure of that, demanding a sum he knew I couldn't possibly pay. Jail was a death sentence for my small ranch. My horses would be sold off, my cabin would fall to ruin, and the little life I'd clawed out for myself would vanish under the snow. Judge Wallace, a man built like a barrel, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, stared down at me. His eyes missed nothing. He'd seen men like me 100 times before, men who lived on the edge and occasionally stumbled over it. Jacob Thorne, his voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. You've taken property from a citizen of this town. A life, in fact. You owe a debt that must be paid. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. Jail serves no purpose here. You're a horseman, not a common criminal. A fine you cannot pay is an empty gesture. He leaned back his chair, groaning in protest. A cruel hint of a smile touched his lips. But a debt is a debt. It will be repaid, not with coin but with responsibility. A responsibility that will perhaps temper that wild streak of yours. He glanced toward the heavy oak door at the back of the room. Bring her in, deputy. The door creaked open, and a collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. Every eye turned, and then she walked in. The cold of the room seemed to intensify, but it had nothing on the winter in her eyes. She was young, maybe 23 or 4, with the kind of innate grace that couldn't be beaten out of a person no matter how hard the world tried. Her skin was the color of rich earth. Her hair, a river of black ink, thick and long, braided down her back and tied with a simple strip of leather. She wore a dress of worn deerskin, patched and faded, fringed at the hem, and cuffs clearly inadequate for the brutal cold outside. A heavy, threadbare wool blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, clutched tight in her hands. She stood straight, her chin held high, but her eyes were fixed on the floorboards, a mask of stone on her face. Her bare ankles, visible between the hem of her dress and her worn moccasins, were chapped and red from the cold. This woman, the judge announced, his voice devoid of any warmth, is of the Apache people. Her village was lost to the conflict 2 winters past. She was brought to the market last month and purchased by the town council for the sum of $5 to be used for labor as needed. He let that sink in, letting everyone in the room contemplate the value they'd placed on a human life. $5. The price of a decent sack of flour. He turned his gaze back to me, and the trap was sprung. You, Jacob Thorne, will take this woman as your wife. You will provide her with food, shelter, and protection. You will be responsible for her conduct and her well-being. This marriage will stand as your restitution to this community. You will take on a burden, and in doing so, you will repay your debt. A wave of shock, then a ripple of muffled laughter and cruel whispers spread through the courtroom. My stomach turned to a block of ice. This wasn't justice. This was a spectacle. A carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to put me in my place, to saddle me with someone the town viewed as less than human, a piece of property. It was a sentence meant to be a constant living reminder of my transgression, a joke they could tell over their beers at the saloon. I risked a glance at her. Her hands were clenched so tightly around the edge of her blanket that her knuckles were white. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, as if she were holding back a scream. In that moment I saw not a burden but a fellow prisoner. The town preacher was summoned, a nervous little man with watery eyes who smelled of mothballs. He rushed through the vows, his voice a monotone drone. I looked at the judge, at the smug face of Leland Cobb in the front row, at the sea of curious and contemptuous faces, and I knew I had no choice. Losing my freedom to a jail cell or losing my livelihood were not options. This bizarre, cruel path was the only one left open. I do, I said, my voice sounding like gravel in my own ears. When the preacher turned to her, she didn't speak for a long moment. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Finally, a word so quiet it was barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound in the cold room. Yes, it was enough. Judge Wallace banged his gavel. Done. Mr. Thorne, she is now your legal responsibility. See that you honor it. Fail, and you will both answer to this court. The crowd began to stir the tension, breaking into low chuckles and conversation. I could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight. They were not seeing a woman, a wife. They were seeing a punishment, a punchline. I turned and stepped back, expecting her to follow. She didn't move. I gestured toward the aisle, my hand feeling clumsy and useless. She finally moved, walking beside me, but not with me, a chasm of cold air between us. We walked down that aisle together, two strangers bound by a judge's whim. The heavy doors closed behind us, shutting out the suffocating warmth of the courthouse and thrusting us into the biting honesty of the winter wind. Snow was falling again, small hard flakes that stung my cheeks. The main street of Blackwood Ridge was a track of frozen, rutted mud. She walked without a word, her moccasins making soft sounds on the snow-dusted ground. Her blanket was pulled tighter around her, but I could see her shiver. A burst of laughter came from the saloon porch as we passed. "Enjoying your wedding day," Thorne, a voice called out. It was Silas Kane, a ranch hand whose cruelty was as well known as his love for cheap whiskey. I ignored him, pulling my sheepskin collar up higher and setting my jaw. I untied my gelding buck from the hitching post. I had only ridden one horse into town. I hadn't planned on leaving with a wife. "You can ride," I said. It was a statement, not a question. She just looked at me, her dark eyes unreadable. I cupped my hands to give her a leg up. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed a foot in my hands and swung up onto Buck's back with a fluid grace that surprised me. She sat astride the horse like she'd been born there, her back ramrod straight. I started walking, leading the horse out of town, away from the prying eyes and the cold, cruel laughter. The wind howled around us, carrying the scent of pine smoke and the promise of a long, hard night. I didn't know what this new life would be, what I was supposed to do with this woman who had been forced upon me. But as we left the last light of Blackwood Ridge behind, I knew one thing for certain. I was taking her away from them. Whatever hell we were walking into, we would face it alone. The walk to my cabin was a little over a mile, but in the biting wind and deepening snow, it felt like a journey across a frozen wasteland. The world had been reduced to shades of white and gray, the skeletal arms of aspens reaching for a sky the color of slate. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots in the snow, the horse's heavy breathing, and the relentless moan of the wind through the pines. I kept my head down, my hat pulled low, but I was acutely aware of the woman on my horse. I could feel her presence behind me, a silent, unknown quantity that had just been irrevocably tied to my life. I wondered what was going through her mind. Did she see me as just another captor, another white man who would use her and discard her? Did she think I had chosen this, that I was a willing participant in the town's cruel theater? The thought soured in my gut. I hadn't asked for this, but standing in that courtroom looking at her, I knew what her fate would have been otherwise. Back to the town council to be handed out for hard labor to whoever needed a pair of hands to sleep in a cold barn or a drafty cellar to be treated as less than a dog. My sentence was her rescue, as twisted as that was, but it was a rescue she had never asked for. As we neared the creek that marked the edge of my property, she spoke for the first time since we left the courthouse. Her voice was low, rough from disuse, but clear against the wind. "Where are you taking me?" "My cabin," I answered, not turning around. "It's just ahead, past the creek." I hesitated, then added, "It's small, just me." I felt a need to reassure her, to let her know she wasn't being brought into a den of wolves. "You'll be warm. There's food." She was silent for a while as we crossed the sturdy wooden bridge I'd built over the frozen creek. The water underneath was a dark, sluggish ribbon of black. "For how long?" she asked, her voice still quiet, but with a sharp edge of something I couldn't quite name. Defiance, maybe. Or just weary pragmatism. The judge's words were restitution. He hadn't put a timeline on it. The debt was to be paid through responsibility. but looking at the rigid line of her back, the way she held herself against the world, I couldn't bring myself to say until the court decides otherwise. For as long as you need, I said, the words surprising me as much as they probably surprised her. You can leave when you want. It was a lie, of course. The court wouldn't see it that way. But it was a truth I wanted to exist between us in that moment. The cabin came into view nestled in a stand of tall pines that offered some protection from the wind. It was a simple one-room structure I'd built myself with rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney that was currently spitting a thin curl of smoke into the gray sky. I'd banked the fire before leaving, knowing the cold would be waiting for me when I returned. Beside it was a small lean-to for firewood, and a corral where my other 2 horses, a tough little mare and a young roan, stood huddled together, their backs to the wind. When we reached the porch, I took the reins and she slid off the horse with the same effortless grace. She didn't wait for me to open the door but stood her ground, watching me, her eyes finally meeting mine in the fading light. They were deep and dark and held a history of pain I couldn't begin to imagine. I pushed the door open. A wave of welcome warmth, smelling of wood smoke and coffee and leather, washed over us. It was a stark contrast to the brutal cold we'd left outside. "Go on in," I said, stepping aside. She moved past me into the single room, her gaze sweeping over everything. It wasn't much. A sturdy cot against one wall, a rough planked table with 2 mismatched chairs, a stone hearth where embers still glowed, and shelves holding a few tin plates, cups, and my meager stores of flour, beans, and coffee. My gun belt hung from a peg by the door. "You live here alone?" she asked, turning to face me. The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning. "Are there others? Am I safe here?" "For 5 years," I said, closing the door and shutting out the wind. "Since I left the army." I unbuckled my gun belt and hung it on its peg. A deliberate gesture. I wanted her to see I meant no threat. She ran a hand along the back of a chair, her touch light, as if testing to see if it was real. "It's quiet. That's why I came here," I said. The silence that followed wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It was a listening silence. The day's events had been too much, too fast. We were 2 people thrown together by chance and cruelty, and now we had to figure out how to exist in this small, warm space, while a storm raged outside. "The cot is yours," I said, breaking the quiet as I moved to stir the fire, adding a couple of split logs. Flames licked up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I'll sleep on the floor." She looked at me then, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was the first crack I'd seen in her stone facade. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze directly. "Because you've had enough people telling you where to sleep and what to do." Her eyes held mine for a long, searching moment. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. She simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement. A start. I put a pot of coffee on to boil and fried up some salt pork with the last of the potatoes. We ate at the table in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of forks on tin plates. When we were done, I blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into the soft, flickering light of the hearth. I laid my bedroll and a spare blanket on the floor near the fire. As I settled down, I could hear the rustle of her moving onto the cot. Lying there in the dark, I listened to the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, wild sound. And I listened to her breathing, a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. It wasn't the deep, even breath of peaceful sleep, but the cautious, light breathing of someone who knew that safety was a fleeting, fragile thing. I knew that feeling well. It was the first night of a life neither of us had chosen. But as the fire warmed my back and the storm raged outside, I couldn't deny a simple truth: it was better than what the town in its cold, righteous judgment had intended for either of us. The first days were a delicate dance of distance and silence. We moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 wary animals forced to share a den. The world outside was a canvas of white, the snow piling up in deep drifts against the logs, muffling all sound and locking us into our shared solitude. The cold was a constant, pressing enemy, and our lives revolved around the simple, crucial task of keeping it at bay. I was up before dawn each morning, the habit of a lifetime. The first thing I did was build up the fire, chasing the deep chill from the room before she stirred. I'd pull on my heavy coat, hat, and gloves and head out into the pre-dawn gloom to break the ice in the water trough and feed the horses. The air would be so cold it felt sharp in my lungs, and the silence of the snow-covered world was absolute. When I'd come back inside, stamping the snow from my boots, she would be awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, braiding her long dark hair with slow, methodical movements. Her name, I learned on the second day, was Anya. I had asked simply, What should I call you? She had looked at me for a moment as if weighing the gift of her name before replying Anya. Just that. No more. And I was Jacob. We were Anya and Jacob. It felt strange to have names for each other, to put a label on the silent figures who shared this space. We ate our meals with few words. I'd make coffee and fry bacon or whatever was at hand. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite. I found myself wondering when she'd last eaten a meal without fear, without having to work for it under a watchful, cruel eye. The courthouse had stripped her of her history, reducing her to a $5 transaction. The townspeople whispered stories that she was defiant, that she was broken, but nobody knew the truth. One morning, as a pale, watery sun tried to break through the clouds, I asked her, "Where were you before the market?" She set down her tin cup of coffee and stared into its dark surface. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was flat and devoid of emotion, a recitation of facts. A farm south of here, owned by a man named Miller. He kept me in the tack room of his barn. It was cold. She paused. Before that, a freight camp. The men there, she trailed off, her jaw tightening. Before that, a trapper. He drank. He told me I was nothing but bad luck. She didn't speak of her village, of the life she'd had before all this. It was a door she kept firmly closed, and I knew better than to try and force it open. I carried my own closed doors, my own past that I kept locked away. My time in the army. I had been a scout. Young, arrogant, and eager to prove myself. I led patrols through canyons and across mesas, my eyes trained to read the land. I found the hidden trails, the secluded springs, the faint signs of life that led us to the small, peaceful villages of her people. I told myself I was just a guide, a mapmaker. I wasn't the one who set the fires. I wasn't the one who pulled the triggers. But as I sat there looking at the quiet strength in her face, at the deep old pain in her eyes, I knew my hands were not clean. I had drawn the map that led to the destruction of lives, of families, of a world. The guilt was a cold, hard knot in my gut, a weight I'd carried every day since I'd left that life behind. "I'm not like them," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "Those men." She finally looked up from her cup, her gaze piercing, searching my face for the lie. She held my eyes for a long time. "You are not," she said, her voice softer now. "Not yet." The words stung, but they were fair. I had a debt to pay, not just to the town, but to something much larger, something my past had made me a part of. The days settled into a rhythm. My work was with the horses. I had a young roan that needed gentle, patient handling, and I spent hours in the corral, my breath pluming in the frigid air, working with him. I noticed Anya often stood at the cabin door, wrapped in her blanket, watching. She never spoke, but she watched with an intensity that told me she understood the language of horses. One afternoon, the roan, spooked by a chunk of snow sliding from the cabin roof, reared up, his eyes wide with fear. I spoke to him in a low, calm voice, trying to soothe him. From the porch, I heard a sound, a soft, melodic humming. It was Anya. The tune was strange, ancient, and deeply calming. The roan's ears twitched, his head lowered, his panicked breathing slowed. He stood still, listening. I looked over at her and she met my gaze, then quickly looked away as if I'd caught her revealing a secret. Inside the cabin, she created her own quiet domain. She swept the floor with a broom I'd made from pine branches. She mended a tear in one of my flannel shirts with a neatness and precision that was almost invisible. I had a small stack of books on a shelf, Shakespeare, some poetry, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, and sometimes I would see her tracing the words with her finger, her lips moving silently. I wondered if she could read, or if she was just trying to connect with a world that had been stolen from her. She began to venture out, exploring the small area around the cabin. She'd walk along the frozen creek, her figure a dark shape against the endless white. One day she came back with a handful of dried brittle weeds. She crushed them in her hand and held them out for me to smell. The scent was sharp and medicinal. "For coughs," she said. "My grandmother taught me." It was the first time she had mentioned her family, her past, without being prompted. It was a small offering, a fragile bridge built across the silence between us. As the second week bled into the third, the unspoken tension in the cabin began to ease. The silence became less of a wall and more of a shared space. We still slept apart or on the cot, me on the floor, but the distance felt smaller. One night a blizzard descended, a furious howling storm that shook the very logs of the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee and the snow fell so thick we couldn't see the corral from the window. The cold was immense, a living thing trying to force its way inside. I stayed up most of the night feeding the fire, making sure it never faltered. At some point deep in the night, I must have dozed off. I awoke with a start to find Anya standing over me. She had her blanket and the one from the cot. Without a word, she draped them both over me, tucking them in around my shoulders. Then she went and sat in the chair by the hearth, her back to me, and stared into the flames. I lay there, warmer than I had been all night, and watched her. The firelight played on her strong profile, on the proud line of her jaw. In that moment, she was not a punishment, not a victim, not a $5 slave. She was a woman of incredible strength and quiet dignity who had just shown me a kindness I hadn't earned, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my chest that the debt I owed was not just to the town but to her. I had to find a way to make this right. After nearly a month of being snowed in, the world began to thaw. The relentless storms gave way to days of brilliant cold sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape glitter. Icicles as long as my arm hung from the eaves of the cabin, dripping slowly, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time. The air was still bitingly cold, but it had lost its raw, aggressive edge. We were running low on supplies, flour, coffee, lamp oil. The trip to Blackwood Ridge could no longer be avoided. I told her that morning as we cleaned up after breakfast. We need to go to town. Anya froze her hand halfway to stacking the tin plates. A shadow passed over her face, the old guarded look returning to her eyes. The cabin had become a sanctuary, a small, quiet world where the rules were our own. The town was a different matter. The town was where she was property, where I was a man living out a joke of a sentence. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I watched as she braided her hair, her movements tighter, more deliberate than usual. She pulled her worn blanket around her shoulders like a suit of armor. The ride was tense. I gentled the young roan enough for her to ride while I took Buck. We rode side by side, the horse's hooves crunching on the packed, icy snow of the trail. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken anxieties. I thought about what awaited us, the stares, the whispers, the smug knowing looks. I had seen the way men in town looked at her before, not as a person but as a thing, a curiosity, a prize. My jaw ached from clenching it. As the first buildings of Blackwood Ridge came into view, I saw her straighten her back, her chin lifting. It was a small, defiant gesture, but it spoke volumes. She would not let them see her bow. The town was waking from its winter hibernation. Smoke plumed from every chimney, and the main street was busier than I'd seen it in weeks. People stopped what they were doing to watch us ride in. I could feel their eyes on us, 100 tiny pinpricks on my skin. I saw a pair of women outside the post office turn their backs pointedly, their heads bent together in gossip. I ignored them all, swinging down from Buck and tying both our horses to the hitching rail in front of Cobb's Mercantile. Anya dismounted with a grace that seemed to rebuke their gawking. She stood a step behind me as we walked up the wooden steps, her presence a silent challenge. Inside the store was warm and smelled of cinnamon, coffee beans, and cured meats. A few men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, and they all fell silent when we entered. Leland Cobb's son, a lanky, smirking young man named Thomas, was behind the counter. His eyes lingered on Anya with an oily familiarity that made my blood run cold. I gave him my list, my voice flat and clipped. Flour, coffee, oil, salt, a few other necessities. As Thomas gathered the items, his movements deliberately slow, Silas Kane walked in. The same ranch hand who had taunted me on my wedding day. A crooked, malicious grin split his face when he saw us. Well, well, he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. If it ain't Thorne and his winter bride, how's married life treating you, Jake? Still getting your $5 worth? The men at the stove snickered. I focused on the counter, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, but I could feel Anya stiffen beside me. Kane sauntered closer, his spurs jingling on the floorboards. He stopped a few feet away, looking Anya up and down like she was a horse he was considering buying. I hear them. Apache women are tough, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. Bet she keeps you warm on these cold nights. But a man can get tired of the same meal day after day. When you're ready to trade up Thorne, you let me know. I'd be willing to make you a generous offer. More than $5, that's for sure. Something inside me snapped. The carefully controlled patience I'd cultivated over the past month shattered. I turned slowly, my hand instinctively dropping to my hip where my gun would normally be. But my gun belt was back at the cabin. That's enough, Kane, I said, my voice dangerously low. He just laughed, a short, ugly sound. What's the matter, Thorne? Afraid? She might prefer a man with real coin in his pocket. He took a step toward Anya, his hand reaching out as if to touch her arm. Before I could move, before I could put myself between them, Anya spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the thick, tense air of the store like a razor. I have had the hands of men I did not choose on my body before, she said, her eyes locked on Kane's, blazing with a fire I had never seen. Yours will not be one of them. The simple, powerful dignity of her words stunned the room into silence. Kane's smirk vanished, replaced by a flush of angry humiliation. He looked from her to me, then to the silent men at the stove, realizing the audience he'd been playing to was no longer on his side. He had tried to mock her as property, and she had responded with a will of iron, reminding everyone in that room that she was a human being who could not be bought or sold. He muttered a curse under his breath, turned on his heel, and stalked out of the store. Thomas Cobb hastily finished packing our supplies, his eyes now refusing to meet either of ours. I paid, and we walked out into the cold, bright sunlight. At the hitching rail, as I tied the sacks of supplies onto Buck's saddle, I looked at her. You didn't have to do that, I said quietly. I would have handled him. She was already mounted on the roan, looking down at me. I know, she said, but some things a person must say for themselves. The ride back to the cabin was different. The heavy, anxious silence was gone, replaced by a new, unspoken understanding. She had not been a victim in that store. She had been a warrior, and I had stood ready to defend her, not out of duty or obligation, but because the thought of a man like Kane putting his filthy hands on her was unbearable. We had walked into town as two separate people bound by a court order. We were riding out as something else entirely. We were partners. Back at the cabin, as we unpacked the supplies, the atmosphere had changed. The small space no longer felt like a prison, but a fortress we had built against the world. That night, as the wind picked up and rattled the windows, I realized the cold between us had finally truly begun to thaw. The town still saw her as my punishment, but she had drawn a line in the snow, and I had stood on her side of it. That night, for the first time, the silence in the cabin felt comfortable, easy. The confrontation in the store had changed something fundamental between us. It had been a public declaration, not of marriage, but of alliance. We sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm golden light on the rough-hewn walls. I was cleaning my rifle, the familiar scent of oil and steel filling the air. Anya was mending the hem of her deerskin dress, her stitches small and perfect. You were brave today, I said, breaking the quiet. She didn't look up from her work. Bravery is for soldiers. I was just speaking the truth. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. She paused her sewing and finally looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You have not asked about my people, about what happened. My hands stilled. It was the door she'd kept closed, the one I hadn't dared to touch. It's not my place to ask, perhaps, she said, her voice low, but it is my place to tell, if you are to be the man who stands beside me. She took a deep breath, and the story came out, not in a rush, but in a slow, painful telling. She spoke of a winter camp, of the sudden, terrifying sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon, of smoke and screams. She spoke of being herded like cattle, of the long, cold march of families torn apart. She didn't cry. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes held a universe of loss. When she finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. The weight of my own past pressed down on me, a physical ache in my chest. My role as a scout, the maps I had drawn, it all felt like a betrayal I could never undo. Anya, I began, my voice thick. When I was in the army, I led men to places like that. I never pulled a trigger on a woman or a child, but I showed them the way. I told myself it wasn't the same thing, but God help me, I know it was. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and ugly. I couldn't look at her. I stared into the fire, feeling the heat on my face, feeling the shame burn inside me. I expected anger, hatred, disgust. I expected her to get up and walk to the furthest corner of the cabin to put the wall back up between us, thicker and higher than ever before. Instead, after a long silence, I felt a light touch on my hand. I looked up. She had moved from her chair and was kneeling on the floor beside me. Her expression wasn't one of anger. It was one of profound, weary understanding. You carry a different kind of scar, Jacob Thorne, she said softly. You did not create the war. You were just a boy caught in it like me. Her forgiveness was a gift I didn't deserve, and it broke something open inside me. The guilt I had carried alone for so long was now shared, held in the quiet space between us. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer just mine to bear. The days that followed were different. The thaw outside was mirrored by a thaw within. We started to talk more, sharing small stories of our lives before. I told her about growing up an orphan, about the first wild horse I ever broke. She told me about the legends her grandmother used to tell, stories of coyote and crow, of the creation of the stars. We learned the rhythms of each other, the small gestures, the unspoken moods. The work on the ranch became a shared effort. When I fixed a broken fence line, she was there, holding the post steady. When she tended to the horses, I would watch, marveling at the quiet, intuitive way she had with them. She seemed to know what they needed before they did, her soft humming a constant calming presence in the corral. One evening I returned from checking my trap lines, a pair of fat rabbits slung over my shoulder. As I approached the cabin, I heard her singing. It wasn't the soft humming I was used to. It was a full, clear song sung in her own language. It was a song of longing and sorrow, but also of incredible resilient strength. I stood outside in the twilight, listening until the song was finished. It felt like I was hearing her true voice for the very first time. That night, after our meal of roasted rabbit and potatoes, she surprised me. She took my extra blanket from its place at the foot of her cot and laid it out beside my bedroll on the floor. "The floor is too cold," she said simply, "and the cabin is too small for such a distance between us." She lay down on the cot and I lay down on my bedroll. We were still apart, but we were closer. Lying there in the dark, I could feel the warmth of her presence just a few feet away. I could hear her breathing slower and deeper than it had ever been. For the first time, it sounded like the breathing of someone who felt safe. The turning point came a week later. A late winter storm blew in, fierce and unexpected. The temperature plummeted, and the wind drove the snow into a blinding horizontal sheet. I was caught out in it, trying to secure the lean-to roof that the wind was threatening to tear away. A heavy, ice-laden branch torn from one of the pines crashed down, catching me in the leg. The pain was sharp and immediate. I managed to hobble back to the cabin, my legs screaming with every step, the cold seeping into me. Anya met me at the door, her eyes wide with alarm. She helped me inside, her small frame surprisingly strong as she supported my weight. She cut away my pant leg with my hunting knife to reveal a nasty gash and a rapidly swelling, discolored calf. For the next 3 days, I was helpless. The leg was broken. I drifted in and out of a feverish haze, the pain a constant throbbing fire. Through it all, Anya was there. She set the bone as best she could, splinting it with boards from a broken crate and strips of leather. She cleaned and dressed the wound with a poultice made from herbs she'd gathered. She kept the fire roaring, melted snow for water, and spooned hot broth into my mouth when I was too weak to feed myself. In my fever dreams, I was back in the army, back in the canyons. The smell of smoke and fear in my nostrils. I'd cry out and I would wake to find her hand on my forehead, her voice a low, soothing murmur in the dark. She was a tireless, unwavering presence. She saved my life. On the 4th day, the fever broke. I woke to a clear head, the pain in my leg a dull, manageable ache. Anya was asleep in the chair by the hearth, her head slumped to one side, exhaustion etched on her face. The fire was low but still glowing. Looking at her, a wave of emotion so powerful it took my breath away washed over me. This woman who had been given to me as a punishment had become my savior. The debt was no longer mine to her. It was a bond forged between us, sealed in the crucible of that storm. When she woke, she brought me a cup of hot coffee. Our eyes met over the rim of the cup. No words were needed. Everything had changed. That night she didn't lay my blanket on the floor. She simply looked at me, then pulled back the blankets on her cot. An invitation. I used a sturdy branch as a crutch and slowly, painfully made my way over. I lay down beside her, every muscle in my body aching. The space between us was gone. She turned toward me in the dim light, and her hand came up to touch my face, her fingers tracing the lines the hard years had carved there. "Rest, Jacob," she whispered. I put my arm around her, pulling her close. Her head found the hollow of my shoulder. Lying there with the wind still whistling outside and the warmth of the fire on our faces, I knew I was home. The debt had been paid not to the town or the judge, but to fate. And in its place, something new and fragile and beautiful had begun to grow. As the last of the snows melted and the first signs of spring began to show on the land, my leg healed. The harsh white of winter gave way to the soft greens and browns of the awakening earth. Anya and I had settled into a life that felt as natural as breathing. We worked together, talked together, and at night we shared the warmth of the cot, our bodies and souls intertwined. The ghosts of our pasts were still there, but they no longer haunted us. They were simply a part of the story that had brought us together. But one piece of the old world remained. In the eyes of the law in the town of Blackwood Ridge, ours was not a real marriage. It was a sentence, a restitution. Anya was not my wife by choice. She was my legal responsibility. The thought chafed at me, an insult to the love and respect that had grown between us. One bright April morning I watched her from the cabin door. She was kneeling by a small patch of earth she had cleared, carefully planting seeds she had saved. The sun shone on her dark hair and she was humming one of her soft ancient songs. In that moment, the love I felt for her was a fierce, protective thing. I would not have her dignity compromised by the cruel whims of a small-town judge. "Anya," I called out. She looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "We're going to town." She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, her eyes questioning. "We don't need supplies." "No," I said, walking over to her. I took her hands in mine. "We're going to see the judge. We're going to end this, and then we're going to start it again the right way." A slow smile spread across her face, a beautiful, genuine smile that made my heart ache. "Yes," she said. "It is time." We rode into Blackwood Ridge, not as a man and his burden, but as a man and his wife. The townspeople still stared, but the looks were different now. The open mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging curiosity, and in some faces a hint of respect. They had seen us survive the winter. They had heard the story of how she had saved my life. We were no longer a joke. We were a mystery they couldn't quite solve. The courthouse was quiet, a few clerks shuffling papers. Judge Wallace was in his office. He looked up surprised as we walked in without knocking. "Thorne," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Thorne, to what do I owe the pleasure? Some trouble, I presume." "No trouble, Judge," I said, standing before his desk, Anya at my side. Her hand found mine and squeezed it tight. "We've come to settle a debt." "I thought the debt was settled," he grumbled. "The restitution is ongoing." "The court's restitution is finished," I said, my voice clear and strong. "The court tied us together as a punishment. That punishment is over. I want it struck from the record." The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And what of the woman, your responsibility to her?" "She is not my responsibility," I said, looking at Anya, at the love and trust shining in her eyes. "She is my wife, by her choice and by mine. We want a marriage license, a real one, signed by our own, will not by a court order." Judge Wallace stared at us for a long, silent moment. He looked at Anya. "Is this what you want, woman?" "My name is Anya," she said, her voice ringing with a pride that filled the small office. "And yes, this is what I want. I am not his responsibility. I am his partner. I choose to be his wife." A strange expression crossed the judge's face. It might have been respect. He grunted, then reached for a form and a pen. He scribbled on it, signed it with a flourish, and stamped it with his official seal. "The restitution order is dissolved," he said, his voice gruff. "The marriage license is recorded. You are husband and wife by your own declaration." He looked at me. "I'll be damned, Thorne. I set out to punish you, and it seems I've made you a better man." We walked out of the courthouse and into the bright spring sunshine. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and new life. We were free. Before we left town, I stopped at the mercantile. I bought a simple, thin band of silver. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. We rode to the creek, to the wooden bridge we had crossed as strangers all those months ago. We dismounted and stood in the shade of the budding willow trees. I took her hand. "I should have done this a long time ago," I said, and I slid the silver ring onto her finger. It shone in the dappled sunlight. She looked from the ring to my face, her eyes shining. "There are no more debts, Jacob Thorne." "No," I agreed, pulling her into my arms. "No more debts." We kissed a long, slow kiss filled with the promise of all the seasons to come. The winter was over. Our life was just beginning. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.